I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Ms. Ashley Becknell. Ashley is the Chief Zoning Official for the City of New Orleans, overseeing all zoning enforcement and permitting in the city, including the city's short-term rental program. Ashley previously started as an assistant city attorney in the city's law department, serving as an in-house counsel on land use and economic development matters, and advising the mayor's office on and other departments on contracts and procedural matters, or procurement matters, excuse me. While in private practice, Ashley worked with a number of municipalities near New Orleans on advisory and litigation matters, including complex land use and zoning issues, as well as large-scale economic development projects. Ashley graduated cum laude from Tulane University as a BA from Tulane in English and Economics. With that, please welcome Ashley Becknell. Ashley, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. This presentation that I've prepared has a ton of information in it, and there's no way I'll get to all of it. So please, if you have questions, I'll have my email address at the end of the presentation. Feel free to reach out to me. But also, I have some links embedded in the PDF copy, so you can go to the New Orleans website, find all of our resources online that I've linked to that'll hopefully help steer you in the right direction. I'm gonna go ahead and get, it looks like I can't do my screen sharing. Daniel, it says that the screen sharing was disabled. Is there a way to change that?
Yeah, let me try to figure out. Let's see.
Dan, if you go to the share content button, you should be able to change the settings. I had to do that yesterday. You should be able to change the settings directly on the screen there.
So give it a try now.
Every day I learn something new about it. Yep. Should be good. Thank you.
Are you able to do it now?
Yes.
Great.
Is everybody able to see my title slide? Okay. So I am Ashley Becknell. I'm the Chief Zoning Official with the Department of Safety and Permits. I want to thank you guys so much for having me. STRs are a very complicated topic. There's, as I said, way more material in these slides than I could ever get to, so please feel free to reach out with me with any questions that you might have. The Chief Zoning Official is kind of a strange title, so just as a quick background on what I do, I oversee all matters related to the application, administration, and enforcement of the zoning laws. That includes short-term rentals, ABOs, which are our alcoholic beverage outlets. I work with policymakers in the law department to make sure things are enforceable and realistic. And we're currently working to restructure some facets of the department because this is a newly created position for me. So I've gotten to really chart my own course. And like it sounds like you are, one of our big issues right now is looking at ways to expand outdoor dining and take advantage of the public right of way to provide more opportunities for restaurant seating so that people can safely enjoy our local economy. So a brief history of our short-term rental regulations would start in August 2015. Short-term rentals have always existed in the city of New Orleans. It was very common for local families to rent their homes out for Mardi Gras or Jazz Fest when they escaped the city and went to Disney World or skiing or some other vacation spot that is not here. But it really became much more prevalent with the development of the online platform. So in August 2015, our city council directed our city planning commission to study short-term rentals. That was the first formal action the city took. Specifically, the council wanted to know whether and where short-term rentals should be permitted and what best practices other cities had incorporated at that point in time. The CPC sent that study to the council in January of 2016, and they included the creation of 3 types of short-term rentals: commercial, temporary, and accessory. They considered but discarded the idea of permanent whole home rentals. It took almost an entire year to draft the ordinances and to pass them due to the competing interests and the repeated and lengthy public hearings. The city of New Orleans has probably logged over 100 hours of public hearings on short-term rentals. Our citizens are very vocal about it and have a lot of strong feelings and are happy to share them, which from a policymaking perspective really is very helpful to see that level of engagement. The most obvious changes was that came out of the 2016 ordinance were that the short-term rentals were defined as a use in the zoning code. That allowed us to decide where they could go in the city and also to regulate them much more directly through a permitting system. The municipal code was also changed to require them to have a special license to operate in the city. Additionally, the municipal code specifically banned short-term rentals in the French Quarter, or the Vieux Carré, which is the most historic part of the city. It's known as the historic core. I'm sure most people are generally familiar with where the French Quarter is. I will note that the French Quarter is specifically protected by the Louisiana Constitution as a historic place. It has its own historic committee, the Vieux Carré Committee, that oversees any development that's done in the Vieux Carré to a very specific level. There are acceptable colors of paint in the Vieux Carré. There are very limited building materials. It's highly, highly regulated because it is such a historic area. And as a result, the council did not want to see short-term rentals proliferate in that area, and so they fully banned them there. We also required that platforms share data with the city of New Orleans. The data would be aggregate, but specific information could be subpoenaed by the city as part of a specified investigation. Because we knew on the front end that we were going to have to enforce against some bad actors. We really wanted to make it possible for us to get the evidence we would need in order to do so. We updated the tax section of our municipal code. We created a fund for all of the short-term rental taxes, as well as a $1 nightly fee to go into, called the Neighborhood Improvement Fund, Neighborhood Housing Improvement Fund, to fund affordable housing initiatives in a way, in hopes of offsetting some of the burden on the housing market that we saw short-term rentals placing even from the beginning. We entered into an agreement with Airbnb that allowed them to collect taxes and remit them to the city on behalf of the users. And we went along that way for a while, until May 2018, when we had a almost entirely new city council sworn into office. Our city council has 7 seats. We had 5 new members in May 2018, as well as a new mayor. And short-term rentals were a very big issue. Here is just one example, but tourism and housing were seen as immediate priorities for this council to address. So at their first substantive meeting, the council took 2 major steps. They implemented an interim zoning district, or an IZD, prohibiting all temporary short-term licenses from being issued. And they directed the CPC to study the issue again to see what lessons had been learned since the first ordinance was enacted. Temporary short-term rentals in our regulatory scheme were seen as the most burdensome. What a temporary short-term rental permit allowed a homeowner to do would be to rent out their home for 90 days over the course of a year. However, it was very difficult for us to regulate that because getting at the data of when someone had hit 90 days was almost impossible. The platforms would only give us anonymized data, and it was by listing rather than by property. So someone could rent for 90 days, delete a listing, create a new one, and get around us noticing that it had been more than 90 days. But also we had no way to correlate what the data from Airbnb and VRBO, how they matched up for any specific property. So essentially the temporary short-term rentals turned into exactly what we were trying to prevent, which was permanent whole home short-term rentals. New Orleans is a very mixed-use city because we're so old, but we do have a lot of residential areas that people want to see kept that way, and short-term rentals really proliferated into those areas. Especially in the parts of town adjacent to the French Quarter, we saw tons and tons of the housing stock converted into large-scale, multiple bedrooms, single-family dwelling units to be used almost exclusively for Airbnbs. And it really put a strain on the housing market, but also on the cultural economy of the city. Many of the neighborhoods that were being affected directly were predominantly African-American neighborhoods, were historically African-American neighborhoods, and were where a lot of our culture bearers really centralized. And they were being pushed out for what we have jokingly called, our historic district has jokingly called brotels. Which are essentially, you know, a 10-bedroom, 20-bed home that you and your bachelor party can stay in so that you can walk to the French Quarter. So because tourism was such a concern for us, it was really seen as an immediate issue that needed to be immediately addressed. And an interim zoning district is a very harsh step because it's just sort of an instant no. But we felt that it was the city felt that it was the only way to really put a hold on things until we could figure out how to best move forward to not only protect our housing market, but to protect the culture of the city, while also balancing the fact that we are a tourism economy and short-term rentals are going to be a reality for us. So a big concern as well was the quality of life for neighbors, and that was something the CPC looked at very intensely in their second study. So here's some more information about the interim zoning district. I know this is a very busy slide, but just in case anyone's interested in the PDF, this has most of the high points of it. It provided a appeal process, and we also asked the CPC again to study and to say what had changed in the 3 years, because this was such a rapidly evolving marketplace. The council really wanted to make sure they understood not only what was going on in the market, but what was going on with other cities and their regulations and best practices. The main issues that we saw that we asked the CPC to look at were platform accountability, changes to the short-term rental categories, specifically around the temporary licenses, revisions to zoning categories to try to limit where short-term rentals could go in the city to lessen the burden on private neighborhoods or residential neighborhoods, updating the fee structure of the short-term rental programs, and trying to find remedies to a legal operation of STRs, both from a quality of life perspective and from a zoning perspective. There's two ways a short-term rental can sort of be a problem. One is it's permitted to be where it is, but it's badly operated and a burden on the neighbors. The other is that it is located somewhere it is not permitted to be at all, the French Quarter being a prime example. They also asked the CPC to look at additional or new prohibitions, including capping measures or tying short-term rentals to homestead exemptions to try to ensure that there would be an owner with a vested interest, ensuring that the operation of the short-term rental didn't affect the neighbors too much. So this second study was completed in October 2018. The CPC studied the issue extensively. They produced a very long but extremely informative study that I would, if you're interested in this, very much recommend going to. I have the link to it at the bottom of this slide. But the major takeaways from this were that the CPC recommended tying residential use of short-term rentals to a homestead exemption to ensure that the owner and operator had skin in the game and was going to have an incentive to be aware of quality of life issues. But the other main area the city really wanted to focus on was platform regulations. That was sort of in 2018 the way that every city was going, and there was a lot of litigation on trying to figure out exactly what that looked like. So we continued to work on this. In January 2019, the council said, all right, go ahead and start working on the actual zoning amendments. And they also asked for a third study to look at additional questions that arose before an ordinance could be fully crafted. They recommended creating several different types of commercial and residential licenses, but fully getting rid of the temporary whole home license. The commercial licenses under the city council's recommendation are really in areas where a transient population is to be expected. Our central business district has a lot of hotels. Our warehouse district has a lot of hotels, and those were seen as good areas for short-term rentals to go so that we could funnel them into places where they would not be disturbing a residential neighborhood. Residential short-term rental licenses, which is the only type you can get in a residential zoning district, were recommended to have very specific requirements, most especially the homestead exemption rule. The study asked whether the licenses should be capped for owners, whether certain kinds of licenses should be grandfathered, and a variety of other issues that had come up over time. So March 16th, 2019, this was such a big issue that the council called a special meeting to hear the zoning ordinances to determine where things should and should not be permitted and whether they should be a permitted or conditional use in that area. It was just the zoning ordinances at this meeting and not any of the enforcement piece. That meeting was 5 hours long and all short-term rentals. So it's an issue New Orleanians feel extremely passionately about on both sides. And in August, the council adopted the new zoning rules as well as enforcement rules at another lengthy meeting. The approved amendments are fairly complicated, but the key points are that residential permits, you can have 3 different types. One of them is a partial unit residential, which is in your home that you own with a homestead exemption, as long as you retain 1 bedroom for the full-time occupant of the home that is not available for short-term rental use. The other bedrooms may be operated out as short-term rentals. This is considered the true home sharing model. The stay in my house, rent my guest bedroom for a weekend. It is also seen as the least impactful because the owner is on site. Small residential was created because New Orleans is a city that has a lot of doubles, triples, and quads. So we wanted to make sure that we were aware of the realities of the architecture in New Orleans. And so the small residential allows for the rental of 1 additional dwelling unit on a lot, on any lot that has up to 4 dwelling units on it. So if you have a double, you can rent the other half of your double as a short-term rental. If you own a 4-plex and you live in one of the units, you can rent one of the units as a short-term rental. Large residential is by far the most intense of the residential permit types. It allows for the rental of up to 3 additional dwelling units on a lot. So in the case of the 4-plex, as long as you live in 1 unit, you could apply for a large residential permit and rent out all 3 of the other dwelling units. However, this one also has the most restrictions. It's permitted in the fewest areas, and we also have specific block face restrictions that prevent more than 1 large residential from being on a block face. And again, all of these require a homestead exemption. Commercial permits are significantly less burdensome, but are only allowed in commercial districts of the city. In those, you are limited to 1 unit or 25% of the dwelling units on the lot, whichever is greater. In many cases, there are large condo buildings that are primarily second homes, and there's been a little bit of a gold rush to try to become that 25%. We also prohibit commercial short-term rentals on the ground floor of multi-story structures to enhance the city's multimodal, pedestrian-oriented corridors. So enforcing the laws was always challenging for us. At the council's request, the Department of Safety and Permits wrote a memo detailing our experiences and recommendations going forward. That memo is extremely extensive, and just to show you, it's 16 full pages. But the main issues that were pointed out were that pass-through registration, which meant that you could apply for an Airbnb listing and through Airbnb apply for licensure with the city, was not workable because of lack of platform cooperation. That monthly data remission really wasn't happening. That we weren't getting subpoena responses, so just an almost total blackout on data from the platforms. That the platforms had not been cooperating under the IZD or even before the IZD, and that the 90-day limit on temporaries was totally unenforceable. I throw these in just because I find most people find them interesting. My short-term rental administrator gave me this list of her top 10 violations and her top 10 loopholes that people found, because short-term rentals, especially in a tourism city like New Orleans, are an extremely lucrative business, and people will go to great lengths to try to keep their business intact. So the new scheme to address these issues specifically required 2 specific types of short-term rental permits. One was an owner permit to be possessed by the owner of the dwelling unit, and the other is an operator permit. That is possessed by the person who operates a short-term rental. In many cases, the owner and the operator are the same person, but in many cases, they're not. Sometimes that's because the owner of the dwelling unit is old or impaired in some way, or just wants their son to run it for them or their daughter. Sometimes it's because people have made very large businesses out of managing multiple short-term rentals across town, especially in the commercial areas. So we wanted to make sure that we had a way not only to reach the property owners, but also to reach the operators if there was a quality of life issue. Another major change was that we required platforms to be licensed by the city. There were some legal issues that I mentioned that popped up around platform licensing that if you are interested in platform licensing, I highly recommend looking into. There's a lot of federal law governing internet websites about regulating user content or sharing user data with government entities. And the city of New Orleans has already been facing litigation pertaining to our rules, not even with the platforms, just against homeowners, alleging a variety of constitutional issues that we've been successful in defending our laws to date. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but the owners have a long list of duties that are intended to protect guest safety. For example, the liability insurance policy requirements, but also to preserve the neighbor's quality of life. Operators are also required to essentially make sure that the owners do what they're supposed to do, but also to make sure that the short-term rental is operated as it is supposed to be, both in the terms of guest safety, making sure that they are providing, fresh linens for each guest and, fully cleaning the unit, but also to make sure that the STR guests are not disrupting the neighbors. There's not criminal activity going on at the short-term rental, that they are not using them for special events, things of that nature. Platforms duties are fairly straightforward. The main thing that we wanted to make sure platforms were doing was that they were not facilitating any illegal or unpermitted short-term rental booking transactions, which means in the way that we've interpreted this, we will alert the platforms that a certain listing is not properly licensed. The platforms have 7 days to take that listing down. We were very curious to see what would happen with the platforms, but we were very pleasantly surprised. They immediately signed up for their licenses, and we found working with them to be very easy, which was not our history in the past at all. And I think it's something that they're coming to realize on a national level, that they are not going to be able to escape regulation forever. And they do need to work with governments to find workable ways to allow regulation of this industry. They seem to be very happy with our model, and we're happy to go into the details of what that looks like for them and why we did what we did. I did hours of research on this, so if you'd like more information, please feel free to email me, but it's really been helpful to have them as allies rather than opponents. So in general, this is an overview of our enforcement structure. What happens is we get a complaint, we go inspect. If there's not a violation found, we close the case. But if there is a violation found, then we provide notice to the property owner. If it's still not remediated, it goes to an adjudication in front of a city hearing officer. And from there, we either place liens on the property or revoke the license or any number of other fines, fees, etc. Homeowners do have the ability to appeal any of these decisions to civil district court, which happens extremely frequently. We found that people were really using the appeal process as a way to put enforcement on hold to keep operating illegally, and that's been a big challenge for us to address. We work closely with our law department to try to figure out what the best way is to keep that from happening. So to go into some of our historic areas in a bit more detail, the Vieux Carré and the historic Marigny districts are essentially the French Quarter and the neighborhood directly adjacent to it. The French Quarter specifically does not allow any partial short-term rentals. So even if you live in your house and you want to rent your second bedroom, you cannot do that in the French Quarter. There are also, if you'll see, I took some excerpts from our zoning table. The HMR districts here are the historic Marigny districts, and the VCC or VCE, VCR is all the French Quarter. The only place in the entire French Quarter that short-term rentals are permitted is the VCE district. And if you look at the map, it's that little light blue corridor. It is essentially just Bourbon Street. Bourbon Street, the French Quarter is a complex environment. As you can see in the pictures, some of it is very residential. And then there's some of it that is extremely commercial, namely Bourbon Street. And so they were seen as less of a burden in that area as they would be in any of the more residential areas of the French Quarter where we really want to preserve its identity as a neighborhood. Again, the French Quarter is specifically protected by state constitution. It has its own historic commission, the Vieux Carré Committee, and they would be happy to share any information with you. I have their website listed at the end of this. Any questions you might have, because what they do is really fascinating, and they have a really interesting mandate that I'm not sure exists anywhere else because of the unique nature of the French Quarter. The other historic area that the short-term rental law specifically addressed was the Garden District. I've shown it on the map. The Garden District is largely residential. It's largely historic homes from the 1800s. And within the core of the Garden District, short-term rentals are completely banned. Bed and breakfasts have historically not been permitted in that area, so short-term rentals were seen as a natural extension of that, as they seem to be fairly similar uses. And to protect the unique history of this area, the city wanted to ensure that short-term rentals did not proliferate. Other historic areas in town are looked at through the zoning ordinance as either historic urban neighborhoods or historic urban commercial districts. In general, the historic urban neighborhoods are multifamily or single-family dwellings in some of the older parts of town, whether that be the university area, Treme, Mid-City, pretty much outside of the parts that all the tourists see every day, but still in some Airbnb hotspots because of their proximity to local mixed-use districts. In those areas, we have only permitted large residential short-term rentals in multifamily dwelling units and multifamily districts. So the other historic areas would be the historic urban neighborhoods where the commercial uses are closely integrated into the residential neighborhoods. If you've been to New Orleans, Magazine Street is the greatest example of this. It's part houses, part bars, part small retail, part restaurants. It's a very walkable mix of uses that people seem to really love. I really love. But it's an area that is very popular for short-term rentals because of its unique draw and unique nature. So as a result, in the mixed-use districts, we have made sure that only commercials are only permitted in the HUMU district, which is our most intense mixed-use district in the historic neighborhoods, but we do allow the residential short-term rentals in those areas. So December 1, 2019 was when the new short-term rental and zoning rules that I've talked about in here take effect. So I'm sure the next question everyone has is, how has it gone? And that is an interesting question, because on December 12th, exactly 12 days after they went into effect, the city was hit with a cyber attack that completely destroyed all of our computer systems. We were entirely running off of paper back to the 1960s, except we had to remake all of our systems overnight, and we didn't have access to any of our historical records while we were doing it. And that really made it difficult for us to implement the new rules, especially when there were things like block face restrictions, because we couldn't see if there was already one on the block face, or the 25% cap because we couldn't see who else was in the building. It has taken the city months. We're still in the process of recovering from that cyber attack. So we're moving fairly slowly to redigitize the records from the cyber attack period, and also to make sure that we are moving forward at the same time. As I'm sure all of you know too, we also, in March, just after we started to get our computers back, COVID hit and we had to switch from being entirely paper-based to entirely digital. So it's been a bit of a roller coaster, and we really don't have great data on how it's gone. We're really hopeful. We've gotten very good feedback from the community, from the platforms. We think that it's going to go very well and really solve a lot of our problems. But I have no more knowledge of how it is going than I did in December, unfortunately, due to a lot of circumstances beyond our control. I specifically wanted to make sure I included a link to this. It's our short-term rental handbook. We realize that the short-term rental laws are extremely complicated, both for our staff and for the public. And so we created a handbook that's about 50 pages that really delves into all of the different license types, provides copies of all of our forms, explains what the adjudication and enforcement process looks like, what all of the responsibilities of short-term rental owners are, and allows people to, at their leisure, investigate what they need to. So I've provided a link. This is available on the city's website, which luckily is back from the cyber attack. Please feel free to download it and refer to it. We hope it's helpful. And that is I know I went through that very quickly, but I figured you probably have a lot of questions. I wanted to make sure I gave you my email address, but I also provided links to our short-term rental website, as well as our Historic District Landmark Commission website. Anything outside of the French Quarter is going to be managed by the Historic District Landmarks Commission. And then the VCC, I have the link for them at the bottom. They're our French Quarter group. So I will, I can leave this up and I can take any questions y'all might have.
Ashley, I'm just going to go ahead and read one of the questions that that came up. And you may have covered at the beginning, maybe just give it a few more seconds, but are short-term rentals limited as to number of rentals per week or number of rentals per month, provided that they do have that permit?
They are not limited. We started that with the temporary licenses in 2016, and we found that it's really just fully unenforceable. Because people can manipulate their listings on the platforms, we aren't really able to get data on how many days or nights they've rented. Because tax data has to stay anonymous, that's not really a great way for us to back into it. And also because there are multiple platforms. Not only have we found people using VRBO, Airbnb, the ones that you've probably heard of, but there are probably 9 to 10 more major platforms that you don't think of immediately. And then beyond that, we found people making their own platforms and renting their homes themselves. So we found that really the issues were not the number of days that a short-term rental was rented, it was the types of renters that were there. And so we really wanted to make sure we got at what the real issue was, which was the quality of life concerns. Loud parties are a big one here in New Orleans. We're known as a party city. So a lot of our quality of life concerns go towards that, which the number of days rented isn't really going to change. You need to have good renters in there all the time, or no renters in there any of the time.
But since you have the extra kind of level of protection of the permit, you actually have some kind of, I don't know, not to say carrot exactly, but some kind of leverage over somebody who owns one, where you could actually cite them for excessive noise and neighborhood disruption.
Yes, we do. We in this situation now where we would have something like that, there are certain violations that are seen as sufficiently egregious that you pretty much automatically lose your license if we find out that they are going on. Most of those are when you're endangering the health or safety of your neighbors in some way, which unfortunately has happened. But most of the time it's just parties, loudness, late nights, disrespectful behavior, and that is handled through an adjudication process where we can revoke not only the owner's ability to have a short-term rental at that property, but also the operator's ability to manage short-term rentals citywide. So it provides a very good incentive for the large-scale operators to make sure that their short-term rentals are operating in a way that respects neighbors, because without this license, they no longer can conduct their business. So it's been a very helpful tool for us to really not only bring them into the fold, but also to have some data on who is doing this and what they're, what homes they're connected with and how the market's working. From a data perspective, it's been really, really helpful.
Thank you. Just to kind of address another question that's come up once or twice, the fee structure that you've got set up, basically are you actually receiving any kind of fee directly from the platform themselves, or is it all coming just from the applicant who then holds that permit?
So all of our license fees come from the applicant, but the platforms do collect taxes. Sure. So the city collects, we have a specific hotel motel tax and a sales tax that are collected that go through the platforms to our Department of Revenue. We also have certain nightly fees, depending on the type of short-term rental, that go into a revamped version of the Affordable Housing Fund. We had a study done to determine what those fee amounts should be. And originally, under the 2016 rules, they were $1 a night. That was seen as nowhere near enough, and now they're significantly higher. So the platforms also collect those nightly fees and remit them to us.
Okay, great. Another question someone just submitted, wanted to know whether you're able to do fee collection from individuals who rent their houses without using a platform. So just independently, maybe on Craigslist or through personal contacts or anything like that, or do you just kind of write those off?
So we don't necessarily write those off, but we aren't made aware of them unless there is a quality of life issue.
Right.
If you advertise on one of the platforms we monitor, and there are several, then we're aware that you're there, although we don't have your address because that's not a piece of information that Airbnb or VRBO or any of them display. Some of the properties, our staff is we have a fairly large short-term rental enforcement staff of about 5 inspectors and an administrator who oversees them. And most of the time they can look at a picture and say, oh yeah, that's the house at 1031 Canal. I know exactly where that is. So it helps to have people who have the institutional knowledge of the city, but for the most part, the way that we find out about short-term rentals that are either operating without a license or operating in a way that's a nuisance, is through neighbor complaints. If your neighbors in New Orleans think that you are operating a short-term rental and you do not post a permit in your window, they will report you to us. I can almost guarantee it. They know how to get us.
So you actually have folks post the permit in the window, so it's visible to anybody who's walking by. Everybody in the neighborhood knows it's an STR.
Yes, it has to be visible so that if there is a quality of life issue, the permits also include a phone number contact for the operator as well as the owner, so that if they're having a loud party or something's going on, neighbors know how to get in touch with the people who are responsible, and those people are required to have somebody there to address the issue within an hour.
Great. Let's see, some other questions here. How do you define and enforce what is a short-term rental, a transient, and what is a regular residential rental? Is the 30-day term state law or local ordinance? Or do
The 30-day term is state law.
Okay.
We have adopted it in the local ordinance, but it is state law that anything that, a 30-day rental is essentially what is considered the bottom line of a long-term rental. It's in New Orleans, it's a little bit different under municipal code. We have 30 days in most places in the city. The Vieux Carré, anything under 60 days is seen as a short-term rental. And short-term rentals are banned outright unless they are specifically permitted through the short-term rental licensing program.
Great. Let's see. I think if anyone else, Dan or Sam or anyone else, if you've got any other questions that you'd like to raise, feel free to raise them.
Somebody had asked previously, I know one of the questions that we had gotten was about how the short-term rentals affected historic preservation and whether they had improved it. And I reached out to our Historic District Landmark Commission and wanted to share some of their feedback on that really quickly. What they've said is essentially that short-term rentals have really resulted in a large number of properties in New Orleans being renovated. The classification of structures has nothing to do with their use of an STR, but from a case study perspective, we find that neighborhood by neighborhood, there is a lot of gentrification occurring around short-term rentals. Gentrification is obviously a fraught issue, but most of the time in these neighborhoods, it does represent a significant investment. In the Marigny, which is the neighborhood closest to the French Quarter, gentrification began there in the 70s and 80s. Short-term rental consisted of updating previously renovated buildings and construction on empty lots. The neighborhood residents there see STRs as negatively affecting their neighborhood. They're really against short-term rentals in that part of town, and that's one of the reasons that they're more highly regulated there. The Treme is also adjacent to the French Quarter. It is a historically African-American neighborhood, really one of the cultural centers of town. The Mardi Gras Indians are part of the Treme and a lot of other, long-standing, really unique historical and cultural artifacts. And short-term rentals really caused rapid gentrification to occur in that neighborhood, displacing residents. The neighborhood was in some disrepair before the short-term rental boom, and over the last 5 years, we've seen massive turnover, massive renovation, but they are not being renovated for the purpose of permanent housing. They're really being renovated for the purpose of short-term rental, which is hollowing out the neighborhoods in a way, forcing the longtime residents out, and making it almost more of a hotel district. And that was something that the new laws really are hoping to address as well. Another big issue that I think is interesting is Canal Street in the city of New Orleans was in the 50s and 60s sort of the glittering retail destination of the city. But over time, the buildings have fallen into disrepair, and many of them don't meet current building or fire code because of the way they're designed. So the upper floors of many of these buildings are empty. And it was one of the biggest planning problems in the city because the buildings, while they were great real estate, the amount of work that would have to be done to make them compliant with code and to find it just wasn't supported by long-term tenancy. However, short-term rentals are lucrative enough that those buildings have really been an area where we've seen a lot of development. So in that part of town, it's solved a really big planning problem for the city. And it's somewhere we're actually very much encouraging short-term rentals. So it's kind of a mixed bag depending on where you are and what your objectives are, I think is the bottom line there.
Do you think, and this is totally a subjective question, so maybe it's a value, maybe it's not, but is there like a tipping point for a neighborhood where you say, okay, well, it's reasonable to say a neighborhood could accommodate, 10%, I'm just sort of pulling that number out of the air, but a 10% short-term rental, 10% of the population being a short-term rental used for short-term rental housing versus maybe 20% or 50%, or at what point does it become no longer a functional neighborhood and now really just a tourist destination?
So for us, it's really a question of residential or commercial. Residential neighborhoods, the policy belief that the city holds currently is that those should stay largely residential. Home sharing of your personal property that you are invested in is one thing, but making it into a hotel and in a business and hollowing out the residency is completely different. And so that's why we've drawn the line between residential rentals and commercial rentals, because they have very different impacts on the neighborhoods at large. So we're trying to maintain the balance by requiring that people have a homestead exemption, which is proof that they live in that home.
I think that makes sense. That's an interesting way of kind of limiting. Go ahead. Somebody else raised a question.
No, sorry, Doug. Didn't mean to interrupt there. There was one it was that first question, so I just didn't want it to get missed. And it was the Claiborne Corridor, New Orleans East, and Algiers are qualified opportunity zones. Have you seen significant investment and short-term rental activity in those areas as a result?
We really haven't. Most of those areas, especially New Orleans East, is sort of the most remote from the tourist hubs. And as a result, there hasn't been a ton of interest in putting short-term rentals in those parts of town. And I don't believe that the neighbors there really want to see that kind of development. It's an interesting balance in those areas because they want more retail, but they don't necessarily want more residents. So we haven't seen those become major areas. As to whether they will be now that the newer laws are in place, I don't think so, but I'm also very curious to see where the short-term rental industry is going generally. I'm not sure if y'all have seen this or not, but Airbnb has taken out very high interest, massive loans during this coronavirus crisis. We've heard from a lot of the local operators who have in the range of 50 to 200 short-term rental units across the city. Most of them are telling us that they've been at maybe 4% occupancy, and most of that is healthcare workers who don't feel comfortable being around their families. So we are very, very interested to see. We see almost no short-term rental activity right now beyond first responders at all. So we're interested to see where the market goes from here. because people are going to have to make mortgage payments on these homes, we foresee a sell-off, but we don't quite know what it's going to look like and where it's going to hit.
Have you all seen, I've read a little bit about, hotels obviously seeing the success that short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and VRBO have had. Have you all seen, I've read about Marriott getting into the short-term rental business. Have you all seen accumulation or anything like that of the hotels coming into that market as well?
We have. Generally what we've seen, and we had to specifically address this through a lot of research and a zoning interpretation, is companies that are blending almost all of what we call the transient use models. We see a lot of buildings that are coming in and saying, well, we're kind of a hotel and we're kind of a timeshare and we're kind of short-term rentals. Like we have kitchens and they're essentially full dwelling units, but we want to be able to rent them out to our subscribers first. And then if our subscribers don't book it up, we want to be able to rent it out to the general public. And that's not a model that our zoning code currently contemplates. Beyond the tax issues with it, just from a zoning perspective, we had to do a little bit of thinking to try to understand where that would work and how that would work. I think it's a market that is really rapidly evolving. And I think one of the biggest struggles for regulators is trying to keep up with it because the wheels of government turn so slowly. So you have to be fairly flexible and you have to give yourself room to be flexible, which is good and bad. As a government official, I like having flexibility, but as a citizen, I don't love my government officials having tons of flexibility. So I understand that it is a delicate balance.
Well, if
Another question, just one last question that just popped up here, just to start with it. How do you determine what your fee structure is going to be, and how do you calculate what an appropriate fee is for STR applicants? Right.
So for our permitting fees, it is based on what it costs us to issue the permits, to review the permits, and to enforce the permits. So those fees are generally, we sort of look at our internal data and have come up with those. For most homeowners, the fees are relatively low. For commercial operators, they're significantly higher. The same goes for, if you're an owner operator or you're just managing the other side of your, elderly parents double, it's a much lower operator fee than it is if you're managing 50 units all across town. The highest fees that we have are platform fees, and those were a lot harder for us to estimate how that would look. But we've found a model that we think works. Platform fees are $10,000 a year per platform, which is high, but they require a lot of work on all of the permitting sides. As far as the housing fund fees, for those we worked with a lot of experts in the field to try to see what the effect of short-term rentals were on the affordable housing market. And we actually had a study done that I believe you can find on our City Planning Commission website that looks at whether we could leverage short-term rentals to create affordable housing. So to say, okay, if you build a 100-unit building, normally you could only make 25 of those units short-term rentals. But if you make a certain percentage of them affordable, then we'll give you more short-term rentals. That's still something that's really just conceptual, and especially now with the large changes COVID's bringing and the uncertainty that that's put into the market, I don't think that it's going to move forward right away, but it is an interesting study, and I do believe it's up. I think it's just NOLA.gov/CPC, but you can also email me and I'm happy to find that for you and send it on.
So we are at the end of our hour, but I want to thank Ashley for a terrific presentation that has given us a great deal of information and raised a lot of really interesting issues, including at least 24 that I hadn't even thought of relative to Lexington's situation, but really impressive to hear you detail the process you went through and all the studies and lessons learned in various ways. So thank you very much for making time to share this with us. Again, we've got Ashley's presentation as a PDF, and that will be available on the Fayette Alliance website shortly. And thanks to all of you who tuned in for this. I hope it was useful and informative. Again, if there are other topics related to local planning, community development, how we make American cities work better for the future as we move through the pandemic and look beyond it, please let myself or Sam or Brittany know. Very interested to hear your ideas and appreciate you tuning in. And again, please do look for future announcements from these organizations about other webinars to address issues of interest to Lexington and other Kentucky communities. So thank you again, Ashley, and thanks to our co-sponsors, and thanks to all of you who tuned in for this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.